Just before midnight on the 5th of May 1944, in Combe Down on the outskirts of Bath in England, a married couple were woken up by banging on their front door. When they opened, they saw a black American soldier by the name of Leroy Henry, a 30-year-old truck driver from Missouri. Like millions of other GIs at the time, Henry was stationed in southern England, awaiting the invasion in France. That night he knocked on the door, claiming to be lost, and asked the couple if they could help guide him back to camp. The wife, having answered the knocking, then accompanied the soldier down the road, supposedly to show him the way. When she did not return after some time, her husband went out in search of her, and found her in a ditch by the side of the road. She claimed to have been attacked and raped. The incident led to a series of unexpected and wide-ranging events that reached as far as Allied High Command. This is the scandal of Leroy Henry. The couple hurriedly called the police, who took them in a car to the local doctor. On the way, they came across Henry walking along the road. The wife instantly identified him, and Henry was promptly arrested. 3 weeks later, he was found guilty of rape by a US court-martial and was condemned to death by hanging. But this is not the end of the story of a cut-and-dried case, but only the beginning of an extraordinary series of events that unfolded over the following months. Britain has never had a colour bar, though it obviously existed in various parts of the British Empire. From 1942 onwards, thousands of American troops, both white and black, came to Britain in head of the invasion of France in 1944. The British allowed the armed forces of various nations to enforce discipline, such as court-martials, but not immunity from criminal law, without the intervention of the British legal authorities. It's important to try to understand Leroy Henry's arrest within the context of the Army's so-called Negro problem in England. As a reflection of American society in the 1940s, the US Army was both racist and segregationist. With very few exceptions, black soldiers were not allowed to carry weapons or engage in combat during the war. Instead, they performed duties in the service sector of the Army, like building infrastructure, unloading boats, doing laundry, preparing meals, and taking care of dead bodies. Black GIs suffered discrimination of all kinds, from poor training and equipment to sadistic commanders, racial violence, and court-martial injustice. US Army officials considered the dispatch of African American soldiers to Britain to be a necessary evil. The invasion of France required too much engineering and supply work to be done by white troops alone, and about 130,000 black soldiers were deployed by D-Day. Originating from the highest levels of command, memos reminded officers that black soldiers are akin to well-meaning but irresponsible children, who generally cannot be trusted to tell the truth. Given such views, it is not surprising that racial violence broke out in all areas of the United Kingdom, where American troops were stationed during 1943 and 1944, although US Army officials staunchly denied that fact. Black soldiers worked in segregated camps and often took leave in towns on different evenings from their white counterparts. Nevertheless, fights between white and black soldiers were frequent. Although white soldiers hotly denied the fact, both American and British officials agreed that altercations were often started by whites, incensed at the so-called privileges black soldiers were enjoying. For example, Fights started in April 1944 in Wolverhampton and Birmingham, when British pub owners served black soldiers. Despite white soldiers' threats of violence, many pub owners doggedly continued to serve black soldiers. British civilians were often supportive on these occasions, following their general like of black soldiers. In some cases, British civilians would buy the soldiers drinks for them. It appeared that white soldiers from the South seemed especially eager to enforce the rules of segregation that they knew back home. In 1942, 2 American soldiers were convicted for armed robbery and sentenced to hard labour and flogging by a British court. The American ambassador, John Winant, was outraged, and the British government relented by abandoning the flogging sentence. He demanded that US military be tried exclusively in US military tribunals. The British government was reluctant to give up sovereignty, but later that year it relented, and Anthony Eden, the Foreign Secretary, introduced the United States of America Visiting Forces Act 1942, which addressed the ambassador's concerns. The US military tribunals were kept busy during the war, as the following crimes were recorded: 26 murders, 31 manslaughters, 22 attempted murders, and 400 sexual offences. As 3 million US personnel visited the British shores during the years of the war, you could not describe it as an out-of-control crime wave. Despite both countries being described as common law jurisdictions, there are some basic differences that are key to this account of Leroy Henry. The US military was completely segregated, with African Americans assigned to non-combat duties. Given that the US was also conducting a war in the Pacific, there were not enough white troops, hence the need to send black troops abroad. In the case of Leroy Henry, would any military tribunal really believe the word of an African American against that of a white woman? Unless the black troops were consigned to barracks permanently, then they had to be allowed out. That meant interaction with the locals, and the possibility of meeting, dancing, and even marrying white girls. The Americans, then and now, make rape a capital offence under Section 120 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. But rape in the UK has not been a capital offence since the 1860s. We now had a situation where a segregated US military had jurisdictional control over its soldiers and could order capital punishment for offences that occurred in the UK. In Britain, interracial marriages were not illegal, but in the US, mixed-race couples could be thrown in jail for misintegration in certain states, and lynching still occurred in the South. Most people living in the West Country had never seen a black man in their lives. The African Americans who came over were used to the segregated nature of American society, and were now told they could visit the municipal baths when open, walk into pubs and restaurants, and sit wherever they wanted in theatres, cinemas and buses. The locals invited them into their homes, and they had a better reputation than white GIs, who were described as overpaid, oversexed, and over here. Relations between black and white US military personnel were dire, and there was an actual gun battle in Launceston in Cornwall between both groups in 1943 that led to 14 African Americans of the 481st Ordnance Ammunition Company being charged with mutiny. This was not an isolated occurrence, as there was a similar scene at Bamber Bridge. It goes without saying that all the African Americans charged were found guilty at each court-martial. The situation back home in the States was pretty awful as well, with interracial riots breaking out in all the major cities, with the worst one taking place in Detroit, where 34 people were shot and countless more injured. It's worth noting that the British government were none too keen on welcoming African American troops or coloured soldiers in the parlance of the day. The Home Secretary, Herbert Morrison, is quoted as saying, "I am fully conscious that a difficult social problem might be created if there was a substantial number of sexual relations between white women and coloured troops, and the procreation of half-caste children." This is the background to the rather extraordinary story in 1944 of Leroy Henry, technician 5th grade of 3914 Quartermaster Gas Supply Company. He came from St. Louis, Missouri, and had joined the army in 1943. At the time he was 33 years old and had previously worked as a lorry driver. On the 5th of May, Leroy was drinking with some army buddies at the Cross Keys pub in the Coombe area on the outskirts of Bath, close to the village of Southstoke, where his military camp was located. Instead of joining his comrades as they made their way back to camp, he wandered off in the opposite direction and effectively went AWOL, walked about 3/4 of a mile from the pub to the centre of Coombe Down, and banged on someone's front door. It is at this point that the accounts of what unfolded differ wildly. While we have sources who give her name, we will call the victim C to protect her and her relatives' privacy. Also, we are not identifying her address. C claimed that she had never seen this man before and agreed to put him on the right road back to his camp. She put on an overcoat over her nightdress and accompanied him down the street. On the way, he apparently pulled out a knife and threatened to kill her if she did not submit to his desires. After an hour, the husband was worried about her absence and went in search for C. He found her in some state of distress, some distance from the house, and she claimed that man she had never seen before pulled a knife on her, dragged her over a wall, and raped her. He found her in a very distressed state, it was claimed, and they contacted the police to report the incident. On arrival, the police took them by car to a local doctor, and on the way Leroy was spotted walking along the road, and he was promptly arrested. He was made to sign a confession after having been denied food or water for 24 hours. As he had only 7 years of schooling, he did not really understand the meaning of the words put in front of him. A few days later he changed his mind and gave a different statement, this time to the American military police. In it he claimed that he had met her on 2 separate occasions and that she had agreed to meet with him that night. Normally he would pay her £1 for her services, but this time she wanted £2, and he could only pay her £1 and some change. What is not in doubt is that they had sex. The doctor who examined C found no bruises or any sign of a struggle or evidence of ill treatment of any kind. On top of that, neighbours had heard no screams or commotion. The court-martial was held at a base near Warminster in Wiltshire. The jury consisted of 8 men who were white and 1 who was black. C gave evidence and claimed that she was escorting Leroy to the train station so he could get to an army camp near Bristol. Bearing in mind that his camp was near Southstoke, 2 miles down the road from where C lived, this discrepancy should have been noted by the tribunal. On the 29th of May, by a verdict of 6-2, he was found guilty of rape and being absent without leave, and sentenced to be hanged. He was sent to Shepton Mallet Prison in Somerset, which had been taken over by the American forces for the duration of the war. A problem at the time was that American hangmen were not allowed to work in England, and so had to rely on their British colleagues. On top of this, they used different means of hanging a man, and a special set of gallows had to be constructed. It was this delay that probably saved Leroy's life. In normal circumstances, he would have been dispatched to the afterlife within days after his appeal. The Mirror newspaper ran a campaign to reduce the sentence to life imprisonment, and their attitude can be summarised in the diaries of Cecil King, who later became chairman of the Mirror Group. The feeling is fairly common that Negroes are much nicer and better behaved than the ordinary Yanks. In the most recent case, the evidence would certainly have resulted in an acquittal in an English court. In far more numerous cases of rape and murder by white American soldiers, the punishment, if any, is of a wholly different order of severity. The case of the African-American GI Joseph Ballot proves this point. He was convicted of molestation of a child in 1943 in Portsmouth, and had his sentence reduced from life imprisonment to 20 years. A white soldier who committed a similar offence only got just 10 years. Leading civil rights organisations and the League for Coloured People sent telegrams to General Eisenhower calling for clemency. What made this case so different? This was just as D-Day was about to occur. The military needed every man to do his duty. The British public were fed up with the general behaviour of American white soldiers. There were reports throughout the country of white soldiers trying to enforce a ban on African Americans being served in pubs. British soldiers would buy them drinks in defiance. The real problem was the dance halls. For the first time in their lives, white soldiers saw a coloured man dancing with a white woman. To their minds, this was intolerable, and there were numerous reports throughout the country of scuffles and fights as a result. An organisation called Mass Observation, which monitored and surveyed public opinion, noted that 75% of the British public disapproved of what they termed as the colour bar. But it would appear that C was not some angelic figure, and had a local reputation as what would be described in those days as a good-time girl, even though she was married and had children. During the court-martial, she could not even identify the alleged assailant, but said she recognised him from his gait and cough. A strange thing to say, to describe a knife-wielding stranger. The Leroy Henry verdict looked very different through British eyes. On the 30th of May, the sometimes volatile Daily Mirror ran a different version of Henry's story, and C's morality was the focus of debate. The paper noted that the housewife had walked 100 yards in a nightdress to give directions to Henry in the dark, and that she had no visible signs of a woman who had offered physical resistance. C's neighbours in Bath, who claimed to have heard no screams or commotion that night, were quick to denounce her respectability. Prominent resident Mary Warwick, for example, wrote to Eisenhower insisting, "The woman is a well-known bad lot. She ought to have been charged with perjury and flogged." Harry Barfel, another local resident, wrote to the US Civil Affairs Department that he did not wish to discourse upon local gossip of the morals of the alleged victim of the crime. In fact, his implication was clear. C was a well-known prostitute. In the context of Second World War Britain, the phrase, "a bad lot," assigned to C the identity of a good-time girl. Girls and young women seen in the company of GIs, in particular African American soldiers, were portrayed as selfish pleasure seekers, engaging in immoral behavior, while the rest of the nation made sacrifices. With their morality so compromised, went the logic, they could not accuse anyone of rape. Good-time girl promiscuity threatened to disrupt national unity in a moment of extreme hardship. As women who cavorted with black soldiers came under particular fire for jeopardizing Britain's racial homogeneity, these anxieties about women's relationship with foreigners existed throughout the war, but they peaked in the years 1943 and 1944 as American troops gathered in Britain for the invasion. The neighbours' condemnations of C as a bad lot raises the question of why the prosecution did not include witnesses testifying to her honour and character. Her case, after all, was weak. As the gallows were being prepared at Shepton Mallet Prison, a local petition for clemency was set up by a local cafe owner called Jack Allen. It gathered just 200 signatures, standard stuff, as Quakers and opponents to capital punishment could be relied on to sign such a petition. But one signature was very important, that of Sam Day, a Bath magistrate and alderman who went on to become the first Labour mayor of the city. On the 5th of June 1944, just one day before D-Day, the Bath and Wiltshire Chronicle and Herald put an advertisement on page 8 calling for a petition organised by both Jack Allen and Sam Day to reverse the court-martial's decision. The results were indeed extraordinary, as 31,850 responded. 10 days later, the petition landed on General Eisenhower's desk. As the appeal on the 2nd of June upheld the guilty verdict, any decision to reprieve Leroy was in the hands of the general. He reversed the decision on the 19th of June, and Leroy Henry was returned to his unit on the 22nd. Much has been made of the role of civil rights movements. They certainly reported on the case, as did the African American press, as well as left-wing media in the UK. But the real problem was the armed forces. The Allies were horribly dependent on American help if they were to win the war. Everything had to be delivered from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines, and African Americans were vital in this effort and got scant recognition for their efforts after the war ended. The sheer size of the petition to Eisenhower from a provincial newspaper shows a deeper problem. As the war progressed, the British people now knew their dependence on American goodwill and money. It was also going to be a painful adjustment, as the jewel in the crown, India, started the road to the end of the empire. To most, American military personnel going overseas meant going to some strange lands where people did not speak English and they were near fighting. But Britain was different. Everyone spoke English, and unless you were subject to aerial bombing or were on active duty with the Air Force, you were safe. But to an African American used to the segregated nature of US society, it must have been an eye-opener. In a white society, you were for the first time treated like a human being. So what eventually happened to Leroy? He disappeared from history. It is believed that he survived the war and returned to St. Louis, where he lived out his life in obscurity. Some say he became a priest. This is unlikely given his level of education. He is thought to have died in 1971, aged 57.